you. Well, I'm extremely flattered that he turned out on this dark and stormy night. Like Dr. Watson would say, Holmes, it's a fine night for a murder. And I'm glad to be here to talk about Kearny's March, or Kearny's March, or Kearny's March. I never can figure out how the man pronounced his name. I know there are various possibilities, but I've often wondered. I think it may be Kearny, and I'll tell you why. Because I'd like to be able to report that I came to this subject in a very academic way, that I have been pursuing this question of conquest of the American West for 25 years and finally exploded onto the scene with it. It was not so. The way I got into this book was I was looking up General Philip Kearny, or Kearny, who was a Civil War general who was for the Union, who was killed in the Valley Campaign early on in the Civil War, and I stumbled across the wrong Kearny. And it turned out that this Kearny, Stephen Kearny, is the uncle, or was the uncle of Philip Kearny, and I saw a little line, the tagline that was in boldface, looking at General Stephen Kearny. It said Kearny's March, and I thought, what a wonderful title for a book. It had a ring to it. So I arrived at my subject a posteriori, as they say in college, but as I investigated this march, it astounded me what had gone on in 1846 and 1847, which was essentially the conquest or the theft, depending on your point of view, of the American West. It made us a nation from sea to shining sea, where before, not too far on the western side of the Mississippi River, everybody thought there was simply a great desert, and they knew there was something out in California, but it was so far away that nobody paid much attention to it until President Polk came into office, and he came in with four objects that he said he was going to do. He told his Secretary of the Navy, John Bancroft, he said, I'm going to settle this question in the Northwest with the British. The British and the Americans owned together something called the Oregon Territory. But it encompassed more than Oregon. It was the state of Washington, Oregon, part of Nevada, part of Montana, and it was all part of the British Columbia, and it was a joint protectorship, or whatever the legal term is, and the British were making, as usual, sort of bellicose gestures about wanting more of this, and the Americans wanted more. They wanted what the 5440 latitude was way up there, close to Alaska, and so there were people running around in the election of 1845 screaming 5440 a fight, and nobody paid much attention to him, but Polk won, and he said he was going to settle that question, and he said the second question I'm going to settle is the question of this tariff, which is causing all this grief down in the South. There was a big tariff put on foreign goods, and it was causing the Southerners to threaten to secede, and then he said he was going to get rid of this national bank that Andrew Jackson didn't like, and Polk, of course, was a protege of Andrew Jackson, being from Tennessee. And Jackson, this was, the national bank at that point was sort of a predecessor to the Fed today, but Jackson didn't like it. He thought it could be corrupted. So Polk said, he said, and the fourth thing I want to do is I want California. He looked at the map of the time, and he didn't like what he saw. He saw America over here, and there was a whole bunch of territory over there, and he wanted coast to coast, but he wanted to buy it. He didn't want a war. It wasn't his style, but he was ready to take it if he had to. And so he offered Mexico a substantial sum of money in those days for California, because they said no. I mean, you don't go around buying territory, and actually the regime at the time that was even discussing it with him was overturned by armed revolt simply for addressing the question of whether or not we do want to sell California to the Americans. And at the same time, there was another deep question brewing in 1845, 1846 over the Republic of Texas, which had separated from Mexico forcibly about 10 years earlier and wished to join the Union. And the Mexicans said, if the Americans, if Congress accepts Texas as a state, there will be war. And again, Polk sent an emissary down to Mexico City to try to smooth this thing over and see if they can avoid the war, but that was unavoidable in this sense, that the authorities would not see the American emissary, and they withdrew their ambassador from Washington, and they put an army on the border, and so war appeared to be inevitable. And Polk, I guess, said, well, I'll take it as it comes. And he was an aficionado of what was called manifest destiny. It was a term that was invented by a magazine journalist in the 1840s. It basically described a doctrine that the United States of America was exceptional and it deserved to be able to expand as far as it needed to expand. And of course everybody had their eyes on the West because you couldn't expand much to the south or the north. And it caught on somewhat. Polk didn't invent manifest destiny. Some people have suggested so, but he was, I think, Eisenhower, the president's son, had a wonderful book called So Far from God on the War with Mexico. I think he described it this way. He said, Polk didn't invent manifest destiny, but he was its ideal agent. And I believe that is quite so. So that sort of sets the stage for what General Kearny did, Kearny's march. The two things I think are significant about his march, and I'll get to that in a moment. And the first is that when General Stephen Watts Kearney marched out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, on that June day in 1846, wherever he went became the United States of America. Now that's quite a mouthful, because he went all the way to California. He went down the Santa Fe Trail with a whole army of 2,000 mounted troops and took Santa Fe from the Mexicans. This is after the Mexican War had broken out. He then marched another 1,000 miles across completely uncharted territory where there weren't even maps. There was nothing out there. It was like, you know, the old maps that you used to see of the oceans where they had these big winds blowing and it said, beyond here, there lies dragons. It was that kind of territory. They knew there were wild Indians out there, but most Americans thought of the lands that were beyond the states on the western side of the Mississippi. They thought it was what they called the Great Desert, because there had been some exploration out there and people, all they found was desert. They didn't realize there was something beyond it. Besides that, and there was. But the second thing I think to take away from Kearny's march is that there were unintended consequences, sinister unintended consequences, because I try to make this point from the moment that General Kearny marched out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, with his Army of the West. That was the beginning of the first phase, which is the political phase of the Civil War in 1846. Because even though when Congress overwhelmingly voted for declaration of war with Mexico after the Mexican army attacked our army down there. They began to have buyer's remorse, I think the Whig Party mostly, because they realized that if we